Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 years ago, the show that looks back to the episode that aired in 1970 and looks at the differences between then and now. This week, episode 5 of Inferno. It's getting hot in here, so take off all your morals. I am Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
And here we are, and here we go into the news from 1970. Firstly, news from the United Kingdom's 1970 general election. On Monday the 1st of June, The Times of London reports a strong counterswing to the Conservatives in the polls in marginal seats that Labour won in 1966. This occurs as the odds between Labour's and Conservatives' betting chances start to even out a bit. Yet on Wednesday the 3rd of June, the national opinion polls now predict a 5% swing to Labour overall. It's up and down with polls in this election, and it will continue to be so until the election day itself, pretty much.
Well, an interesting point here that corresponds to a recent electoral experience for us, the 2019 general election, is lots of people looked at the national polls and thought, oh, they won't have such a commanding majority. I believe I'm the only one of the three of us that predicted roughly what seats
Yes, you are right.
Yes, dear.
And
Yes.
And that was because I was paying attention to the local on the ground stuff where people were saying in what's called the Red Wall, which were former Labour constituencies in the Midlands and North Wales, where polling there showed a collapse in Labour support. And so it's interesting that it shows that localised polling of swing seats seems to be actually more useful for our elections than a headline national figure, which makes sense because essentially a British general election is just 650 local elections, isn't it, really?
Yeah, for all its pomp and grandeur and circumstance.
Yeah, way to ruin it, Nick.
On Tuesday the 2nd of June, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, George Brown, says to his constituency in Leicestershire that a third consecutive Labour victory in a general election would turn Britain into something like Sweden's Social Democrat Party, which has been in a government of some format since 1932. For irony's sake, I will note that George Brown was defeated in the 1970 general election in a 4% swing and a gain to the Conservatives. Ha 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 ha.
Interesting, nowadays, Scotland a lot of the time tries to portray itself as sort of more allied to its Scandinavian roots.
This has always been the case, I think, for many years, that people on the left quite often point to Sweden and say, we should be more like that. I think that's done in a lot of English-speaking countries, but I mean, I know it is here. Often people in the Labour Party argue we should be more like Sweden. Sweden does this. Why can't we be like them? So it's interesting that they were saying this in 1970 as well.
That's quite enough of election news. We shall move on to more local news. On Monday the 1st of June, whilst the British police say that they are doing all they can to recruit more members from the coloured minorities, and that is an actual quote, the chief constables are determined not to lower entrance requirements into the police force. Collating race with lower standards for jobs presents a subtle undertone of racism, and I'm going to say no more on the subject.
But we will.
Me and Luke will. Yeah, so I didn't read that as the police chief constables being saying a racist statement. It's more, I think, a reflection on attitudes at the time. People might think, oh, if we're having more police officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, that people might think, oh, they must have lowered the standards. Because how's this happened? And I think that reflects that society was just a bit more racist 50 years ago.
Because when you can present it as a purely meritocratic element, but ultimately people's views and ideals on class, race, educative background and all that will taint the black and white meritocratic ideal.
From a more modern day perspective, I kind of read this as, that wheelchair lesbian got the job because they're just filling a diversity quota. I thought they were more saying it as that sort of angle where they're saying, we're not just going to hire this person because he's black. We're still going to be meritocratic about it.
Just to my mind, it doesn't need to be said. I mean, you would just assume if someone's a police officer that they got there by their own merits. I just feel like a remark saying we're not going to lower the standards is just sort of pandering to people who might get concerned all of a sudden. Just not the sort of, like I say, not out and out racist. Just that sort of back of your mind, subconscious, like not wanting to be racist, but just, the sort of person who goes, who might walk down a street and see a majority of people who are not of their own race, let's say, they suddenly clutch their bag a little bit more.
Subconscious racism exists 50 years ago, and it definitely exists nowadays. How about that? And finally, on Tuesday, the 2nd of June, NASA admits that bacterium from Earth had survived on some thermal insulation situated on the moon for 3 years. It's an achievement for bacteria, which can survive space with little to no trouble, and a minor embarrassment for NASA, as their rigorous decontamination processes apparently don't wash up to much. It's an interesting note to compare 50 years ago to the health-conscious world of 2020.
This one does intrigue me because I remember reading a book when I was 11, so that's 14 years ago, where they were talking about sending a probe up into space and how they clean it and clean it and clean it and clean it, because the last thing they want to do is find an alien bacterium that is really just somebody's snot. So it shows that something like this, it really freaks you out, because if you're only going up to the moon once a year, it shows that you've really got to be on the money about what you're doing. So even something tiny like this can make the newspapers because of the massiveness of what you're doing and the rarity of it.
Well, also it gives the kind of worry, let's say a spacecraft went to another planet and picked up some bacteria on its surface there. Clearly, if they've, cleaned it, which they would if they collect it back on Earth, you're still a bit concerned there, aren't you, that there's going to be some alien bacteria, and we have no idea.
Oh, God. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, well, we know that there is bacteria on Mars, so imagine a manned Mars mission, for instance, going there, picking these things up. We have no idea what effect it could have. I mean, it probably wouldn't kill us all or anything like that, but, it's just I'm hoping 50 years on our decontamination methods are better.
Yes, we spray him twice with Dettol.
No, actually, we ingest it. Remember, Luke? We inject
yes, of course.
into ourselves.
Ingestation, injection, yeah. What can I say about that, really? Other than, I think that was the news. And now we shall get into Inferno, episode 5, aired Saturday the 6th of June, 1970. This is the apocalypse section. We quickly establish that this world is going to die, which is a rare staging point for Doctor Who, where victory, if any, is bittersweet and comes at a large cost. And I would argue that we need more of that, partly because I'm a negative Nancy, and partly because it subverts the black and white morals of a hero, and instead presents a more lucid grey morality where every great decision creates ripples. To put it into modern context, yes, applaud the lifesavers, but do not applaud 20,000 deaths as a good result, and rage when the target is exceeded speedily because of government inaction. That's my take, anyway. But back to the episode.
I think you're absolutely right on the more grey morality of it, because it's about really working for that victory, and what do you do in order to get there when you're up against such adversity is the real, driving point of this. Knowing that everyone's going to die, but there is something good that could come out of it, and that's really powerful.
And I definitely... the Doctor in this, he is morally grey, isn't he? He's not a hero. That's why we have Sutton, because the Doctor isn't the superhero character in this one, is he? He's just a sort of scientist. And this really does paint Sutton as the action hero type, doesn't it?
He's the swashbuckler, as it were.
Yeah, I know. Which, is what really sticks in the craw is that he's really dated now. All the other characters, don't seem so bad. But like Sutton, like he is that very typical, like 50 years ago kind of gender politics there, isn't there?
Definitely, yeah.
And it does as a modern view, it does stick in the craw a little bit that he's like 100% like the best person in the whole thing. Like there's nothing wrong with him. He's like the pure good guy, and it's like, but it's nice though. This is rare that the Doctor isn't the hero of the piece, isn't it?
Yeah. So whilst the Doctor wants to try and leg it, we shall be running straight towards the danger and look at this episode in greater detail. Penetration 0 happens, and everybody sensible legs it. The Doctor, Starman, and Sutton go into the drill head, which is oozing green slime galore. Under the anonymity of protective clothing, Starman whacks Sutton over the head with the intention to slime him. The Doctor saves Sutton and has a fight with Starman before Sutton saves the Doctor, and the pair escape the drill head. Starman then seals off the drill head and infects all the unconscious scientists and technicians with the slime.
So in contrast to last week, it feels like we had a bit of a reversion here back to more like the 1960s, where there's karate chops to the back, and the stuntmen will be to hide the stuntmen. They're just in the protective gear, aren't they? So you can't see their faces.
Although it makes sense because it's hot.
Yeah, I know. It's just a sort of way for them to cut costs. But I mean,
it does assist. Yeah.
The main thing I was thinking of is, so we had that brutality of the scene in the
previous episode.
In the previous episode, in the
prison
jail room, and here we now just go back to karate chops to the back, which look really quite bad in comparison.
Well, I think this shows that they're not focusing on this with an agenda. When it comes up that they can do it a bit more brutal, they do. And, in fact, as Pertwee's era goes on, the brutality goes right through the floor, and battles become sort of the fun, swashbuckling thing. But, especially in the Demons with that Morris dancer, what was all that about? But the point is that this isn't something they're focusing on, so it's not that big a concern of theirs at this point in time.
So it was just happened to be a happy coincidence that they decided, that this bit really suits having a slightly more brutal scene. And here, because they haven't got an agenda, it's just back to normal.
Yeah.
And it's the storyline that gets to be all grim and dour instead of the actual action within it. The Doctor fears the worst as explosions keep on happening, earthquakes happen across the country, and the drill keeps on drilling. The brigade leader's been given charge of the situation by the authorities, but ultimately they've been left on their own to contain it. Unfortunately, it's a doomsday scenario because the Earth's core cannot be capped and it's going to disintegrate the world. Just go with it. In comes a mutant technician and bullets do not stop him. Fire extinguishers do. The cold kills. Sutton and any remaining soldiers are held basically at gunpoint and are not allowed to escape. Instead, Sutton is instructed to do your duty for the Republic and the dictator. It's discipline at the worst possible time.
So, speaking of rules, I was thinking a lot about the Brigadier and how the portrayal of the top soldier here would betray something about how people were thinking about soldiers back then. So, a lot of what the Brigadier has been doing this season is coordinating with the high-ups. He's a bit like Uhura in that he's like, hailing frequencies open to Geneva, Doctor. And, in Spearhead, he speaks to Scobie. In the Silurians, he's speaking to the Ministry, or whoever it is.
Yeah.
And in Ambassadors, it's Geneva. So he's sort of the voice of establishment and the voice of rules. And
he's almost even a bureaucrat in our universe, isn't he?
Absolutely. But we like him the most when he's bending or breaking the rules, like when he goes against Scobie. We dislike him when he kills all the Silurians. And we like him again even more in what is really one of his redeeming moments when he faces off against Carrington at the end of Ambassadors. That's when he's really like that pinnacle for the Doctor. So here, it shows that the brigade leader is just consumed with this anger and this love of the rules. So it must show some perception of military officers being those rule-bearing types.
And as we said last episode, fascism is basically the ultimate end goal of clinical bureaucracy.
Absolutely. Which, compared to how you can see officers today, some officers are seen as those lions leading donkeys, and others are seen sort of as war heroes who were up there commanding the men. It's
mavericks that keep on walking.
Exactly. British officers don't duck.
So we like our bureaucrats and our leaders to follow the rules, but sometimes bend them as well.
Bend them to good morals. It's also interesting that, like, pre-First World War officers are kind of considered really, upstanding and wonderful and brandy sipping, and the grunts maybe were considered a bit more barbarous. But after World War II, that division is, well, in fact, after the Great War and then solidified by World War II, you get a lot of respect for the grunts, and then the high-ups not so much. So it's an interesting...
that reflects what happened in the 20th century, because in Britain and in England in particular, up until the First World War, the army was a professional body. It wasn't something that you were forced to go into. Most people didn't. Britain had a tiny military at the start of the First World War, and it was renowned for being very well trained, but minuscule. And so I think that reflects, before the First World War, it was, aristocratic. That's where the aristocrats went. And so the people who went in there, who would choose to go into the army, sort of thing. So we didn't think of them so highly. But then during the 20th century, loads of people experienced fighting in the military, didn't they? Because of conscription. Suddenly,
but also through volunteering, yeah.
Yeah, so suddenly it's an experience that most people had never really seen or heard of anything about it, apart from, the hero worship in newspapers, whatever, of the aristocratic officers who went out to Africa and, put down the savages or whatever sort of thing, nonsense like that. And then in the 20th century, this experience is opened up to everyone. Most people would have known someone who fought on the front line in the war, won't they? In both the First and Second World Wars.
Every town, every village, pretty much. Yeah, but as you say, as the army swells its ranks to include any old iron, there is that correlation that as you include people of all backgrounds, classes, gender, races, and all that, you include a greater sense of humanity.
Yeah, and so that's why suddenly people start to have more respect for the grunts, because their stories are known, because everyone knew someone who fought in the war, sort of thing. And conscription was still going on, wasn't it? Well after the war.
Somebody had to clean up the mess.
Yeah, when did they end conscription? It was still going on in the 50s, I know. Did it end in the 60s then?
Late 50s, early 60s, I believe.
Right. So there will still have been quite a few people around, even in 1970, who will have, even quite young people who would have been conscripted to the army.
These are things we must think of as people keep on calling for the retention or re-establishment of national service. Sutton, who's become a full doom-monger thanks to the Doctor, tries to reason with Petra. No help's coming, accept your fate, and she eventually does so. At this point, there's a cut scene with a radio broadcast about the disaster. The Doctor reasons that the best solution is for him to get back to the normal universe, and the brigade leader and section leader Shaw investigate the Doctor's console. Sutton and Petra plot their escape, whilst the Doctor shows the possibility of his escape with a brief time jump.
So this is when Petra starts to realise she is going to die, and how they have unleashed the energies of the Earth's cores, the Doctor says. And it's an interesting look at the fact that the Earth really does have some power, because nowadays when we're using our laptops or we're throwing a plastic bottle in the bin, we're not really thinking about the effect we're having on the Earth. And the fact that back then they were saying, the Earth is screaming out in pain, it shows that this idea of the Earth's power and how it will come back to destroy you, it shows that it didn't work. Nothing has worked. And now we're screwed.
Which is why it's still being referenced in Doctor Who episodes 50 years on.
Well,
Exactly.
yeah, it was the big difference is, so there are more and more voices saying the Earth will destroy us. We're simultaneously more aware of it, but also more indifferent to it.
Absolutely. And the relationship man has with the power of the Earth is kind of going a bit all over the place. So I wonder how this might be worded if this was made by somebody from 2020. It's strange to think of the Earth, belching out Krakatoa, because we kind of have this idea that it's much more slow moving, and it's not a hurricane that will just overnight go. It's more cancer, which rots you from the inside over
I
4
think
years.
I think we have a good example from New Who about how they might approach something like the Earth. Well, I mean, this is more humans than the Earth itself, but where, as the Sontaran one, where it's the atmosphere gets poisoned. So I feel like it would be something more akin to that, where if it was the Earth, some sort of vent might open up somewhere from these, and so rather than being a volcanic eruption, it just is emitting all of these gases that poisons the Earth's atmosphere. But would be slower.
I'm thinking more about the episode from the most recent series with the plastic that gets into all of the birds. That's a lot more slow moving, and it feels a lot more real, and is definitely based on an obvious real world issue. So rather than, right, we pressed the ground too hard, now we exploded it, it's more, we pressed the ground too hard at 1,000 different points all over the Earth, and now our food's gone.
Yeah, well, that's ultimately what climate change is, isn't it? It's the death of the Earth's climate by 1,000 cuts.
So this is rather miserable. Can we move on?
Yes, yeah. Alas, we're dealing with hard-hitting apocalypse scenarios, and we are not short of them 50 years on. Stahlman speaks out through the communication system at the drill head, convincing Petra to let him and the technicians out. They've all mutated, and they attack, turning Benton in the process. Our remaining humans take refuge in the brigade leader's office, and the doctor cuts the mutants off from the drill head so that they have time to think, whilst the mutants acclimatise. In the other universe, Sir Keith Gold's driver has been blackmailed to make sure that Sir Keith doesn't get to the drill site until after penetration 0. Sir Keith managed to convince the ministers to suspend the project, but oh no, he gets involved in a car crash. In the parallel universe, the mutants begin to attack after most of the humans agree to the doctor's plan to escape.
One point I think is at the same time as when we see the Primords, is that they do that shot they did in the interrogation scene last episode. Here they, where the shot, like the sudden, you see all their eyes kind of go, "What the hell?" sort of thing. That sudden take. So again, we're thinking, they had like 3 or 4 cameras all kind of at the same time. They just switched the feed between all of them. They didn't want to edit scenes much, did they, at this point?
Absolutely not. You were probably still doing it with a razor blade and glue. And
indeed, it's even more expensive to do so given its colour film as well.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I was saying there is an absence of the, like in 60s Doctor Who episodes where it just kind of fades to black and then another scene. So that's where there was like an edit there. I've not really noticed that this season.
No, but then you'd have to think in the case of 1972, they believed truly that it might be their last season. So what's the point in including fades to black for outside overseas sales?
Oh, is that what that was for?
Yes, yeah, it was.
Why?
And indeed, it's probably, if you've seen them in Classic Who, it's probably because it's been recovered from overseas, which includes the overseas fade to black for the adverts.
Oh, interesting.
TV history.
So I've read a lot about werewolves in cinema and what somebody in the 1970s might have been thinking about werewolves. Because when Benton turns into a Primord and the way they look, they're werewolves. Essentially, the way that Benton's transformation goes where it fades and more hair is stuck on him, that's basically from the Wolfman and from 1941, and is essentially how it would be going until 1981. So that's essentially how people thought of werewolves transforming back then. So all standard there. Once you get past the 40s, like with all monsters, like Frankenstein and Dracula, it's basically all schlock and Abbott and Costello garbage until you get to the early 60s. You get some Hammer horror stuff. Once that fades out, you just get foreign stuff. So in the 60s, it's mostly foreign stuff that's involving werewolves, apart from the Munsters, where it's this cute little kid. Also, werewolves look rather human. It's not until the mid-70s that they look properly animalistic. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that people's memory of werewolves would be they were good a while ago and then they kind of became a joke, and it was just a guy with some hair stuck on his face running around. No one would really have watched these underground Italian movies that no one's ever heard of. What I'm trying to say is, werewolves were basically a joke at this point. They were that thing from ages ago that maybe Hammer, made people like it a bit more. But you got the Munsters in there. These things are jokes at this point.
So in this serial, the werewolves are just a point that nobody cares about, so they've not even bothered to do much with them. Or you make them look good or whatever, because that was the point, no one cared. But in New Who, we have the werewolf episode, and it's like the star attraction of that one in terms of the special effects. They put loads into that, didn't they?
Yeah, and it's a proper animal in that one, as opposed to just a dude.
Yeah, and yeah, and it's pretty brutal. All the just audibly, just you only hear the audio of the brutality, don't you, in that one?
Yeah, and you get the reaction shots again as people watch it devour humans.
Interesting. 50 years ago
So,
and now.
Indeed, there are some progress points, and then there are some bits that stay the same for werewolves, for apocalypse scenarios, and for Doctor Who and the context in which it is surrounding. Thank you very much for watching. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube, where you can like, comment, and subscribe. We shall be back next week to howl about the penultimate episode of Doctor Who Season 7, Inferno Episode 6. Until then, I've been Ben.
I've been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.